St. John of the Cross, 16th century Spanish theologian, called joy the primary emotion. And he said it's because the object of one's joy is the full satisfaction and experience of that thing. When we experience joy, we seek to put our full satisfaction in the object that we find joy in. In other words, joy is the experience of fullness and wholeness and a sense of completeness in a thing. And is there anything more central to the human experience, to the human desire, to the human soul than joy? Yet this primary emotion, St. John of the Cross calls it, or this primary experience can often feel elusive, it can often feel nebulous, difficult to grasp, difficult to explain, difficult to understand. It is sort of like a steam coming out of a kettle. You can see the steam coming out of the kettle, but the minute you try to grab onto it, the very act of trying to grab onto it is what causes it to disappear. It's elusive, it's nebulous, it's difficult to understand, difficult to explain. Zadie Smith, the English novelist and essayist, in her 2013 essay on joy in the New York Review of Books, she notes that since we all desperately long to experience joy, and since it is so difficult to understand and so elusive, we can often mistake joy as the climax of pleasure. So we think if I keep going down the road of pleasure, at the other end of this road is joy, as though joy is the most intense version of pleasure. She said that would be to misunderstand the very nature of joy. This pursuit of joy, this deep longing for fullness, for wholeness, is not just an abstract activity, it's not just an abstract desire, but it exists in a broken world, surrounded by sorrow and suffering. Essentially, we long for joy in a world that is difficult to live in. Close friends have walked away from us, close family have departed from this life, sickness, death, and pain persists. Parents aren't who we need them to be, children aren't turning out the way we had hoped. My family feels trapped. My life feels trapped between the competing needs of my spouse, my children, my friends, my career. Even the friendships that I do have are beginning to feel strained. I still don't have enough space to grieve the losses in my life, not including all that's happened in this pandemic. And every morning that I wake up, I'm reminded I've still got back pain. We long for joy in a world that is difficult to live in. And so it begs the question, is lasting joy possible, or will sorrow have the final word? Should I content myself with submarine sonar beeps of pleasure in a world of sorrow? Will my sorrow have the final word? Or is lasting joy truly possible? This is the question of the psalmist. When the psalmist recalls the memory of joy, there's almost a yearning in the present that asks the question, was that just a beep of pleasure in a sea of sorrow? Or is lasting joy truly possible? Can joy be restored in our lives? Or was it just a momentary, elusive point in history? As we go through Psalm 126, we're going to consider this question through 2 points, breaking this psalm into 2 parts. Verse 1 to 3, looking at the memory of joy, and verse 4 to 6, the restoration of joy. So firstly, the memory of joy, verse 1 to 3, and then the restoration of joy, verse 4 to 6. The memory of joy. The context here, while scholars aren't quite certain, seems to be the exile from Babylon. So when the psalmist says that the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, that phrase, restored the fortunes, literally means the Lord turned the turning. It's kind of like a Hebrew idiom. Older translations say returned the captives. In either case, however you interpret it, it's most likely referring to when God delivered the people from exile in Babylon, restored them, released the captives, restored their fortunes, returned the people. And so this joy that the psalmist is remembering is a joy that follows a long and difficult season of sorrow. 70 years to be precise, 70 years of uncertainty, 70 years of confusion, 70 years of questioning. Where is God? Will we ever leave this land that is strange to us? And so out of those 70 years, those 70 difficult years of sorrow, comes deliverance. And then out of that deliverance, unspeakable joy. The psalmist describes this joy, verse 1, as we were like those who dreamed, beyond our imagination. We had to pinch ourselves. It was just unbelievable that God would actually come through in his promise. Verse 2 says that we were filled with laughter. It was hard to believe. It reminds me of the first instance of laughter in the Bible, when Sarah overhears God speaking to Abraham and says, you're going to have a child, and Sarah just has to laugh. Okay, at my age, at his age, you have to laugh because it's that hard to believe. In verse 2, the second part of verse 2 says, then it was said amongst the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. Even the nations were speaking about this great deliverance. So it was undeniable. There was objective witness. It wasn't just some subjective experience within their own lives that could be challenged, but there were witnesses outside of their nation saying this indeed has happened. So it's beyond one's imagination. It was hard to believe, and yet it was completely undeniable. The psalmist recalls a work of God that birthed deep and profound joy. A joy beyond imagination, hard to believe, and yet completely undeniable. And it reminds me of, I need to be careful here because I don't actually have a memory of this, but it reminds me of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day in England, 1945. I remember in history class, if there's one thing I learned from history, it was all the stuff about World War II, and I don't quite know why. But I remember watching these history tapes where you saw the streets of London flooded with people. Streets that were once empty because everyone was worried about the night to come and whether there would be more bombings to come. All of a sudden, full of people celebrating non-stop. Just shouts of joy, shouts of jubilation. It was like, is this actually happening? Is this war actually over? And the joy wasn't just from the fact that the war's over, but it was from the fact that now we can actually dream about the future. And I have to imagine that that's probably what the Israelites felt at that time. Coming out of exile wasn't just the joy of deliverance from exile, but a question of we can begin to dream again about the future. Joy beyond one's imagination, hard to believe and yet completely undeniable. It's worth noting at this point that this is not, this joy that's been described, this memory of joy that the psalmist writes about, is not an unhealthy experience of nostalgia. It's not a sort of take me back to the good old days. Let's remember Ecclesiastes 7:10 says, do not ask why the former days were better than these. It is not from wisdom that you ask this. So this is not it's not an unhealthy experience of nostalgia. It's not an attempt to fossilize joy. It's like that experience that we had when we came out of exile, there can never be a moment in our lives better than this, and so we have to go back to that period of time and fossilize it forever. But this is a memory of joy for the purposes of looking forward. It is a memory of joy that calls the great acts of God, so that as the psalmist turns forward, the psalmist can then petition to God for a new work of God in the life of God's people. And so we see after the memory of joy, verse 1 to 3, we have verse 4 to 6, the restoration of joy. Notice that from verse 1 we have restored in the past tense, when the Lord restored, looking back. We then move in verse 4 to the present and future tense, restore our fortunes, Lord. So the psalmist looks back in verse 1 to 3, and then looks forward in verse 4 to 6. The psalmist looks forward and says, essentially, will our sorrow have the final word? Was that memory of joy just a beep of pleasure in a sea of sorrow? Or is lasting joy possible? Can you restore us again? Can you renew and resurrect our joy. And the two images to represent this restoration that the psalmist longs for is first of all, a geological image, and then secondly, an agricultural image. So in verse 4, it says, "Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev." This is a geological image of an arid desert with many dry and huge riverbeds, absent of life. All of a sudden, when the spring comes and thunderstorms come, it is flooded with water and transforms from an arid desert into a river flowing with life, flowing with greenery and fullness. You can actually see videos of this on YouTube. It's remarkable. It still happens, and it's still a phenomenon even today. It's an image of rapid restoration, transformation in seconds. And then in verse 5 to 6, we have an agricultural image of the restoration of joy. Like those who sow with tears. Verse 6, those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow. Here you have an image of arduous toil, of significant investment, of labor, but with no certain guarantee on the other side. And so this image of the restoration of joy is one that is of a slow transformation, full of years of uncertainty and months of no visible change. The point here is that the restoration of joy can both be rapid and slow, dramatic and progressive. Both can be possible, and neither should be assumed. Yet in all things, the psalmist says, joy will prevail. So this is why it's important for us not to see, especially this latter part of the psalm, as a sort of a bumper sticker passage. Isn't that cute? We're all going to be happy in the end. Actually, the restoration of joy can be met with years of uncertainty, months of no visible change, days of toil and labor. The psalmist is showing us a vision of the restoration of joy that has joy at the other end, but a not so certain path in the meantime. The psalmist looks back on a joy remembered and then looks forward to a joy to be restored. One restored like the desert that will soon flow with water, become lush with greenery, burst with life, but also toward a restoration of joy that comes with toil and hardship, with uncertainty in the meantime, with days of planting, months of waiting, no immediate signs of life. And yet the psalmist says, joy will prevail. As we look forward to the rest of this year, none of us know what will remain to be seen or to be experienced. I'm sure in 2019, none of us could have seen what the next 3 years would unfold. Heck, in January, I don't think any of us saw what could have happened in February or March. For some of us, seasons of sorrow have been met with seasons of sorrow. Certainly as a global society, that's been the case. At the tail end of what seems to be the end of the pandemic, we were quickly met with the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And I'm sure as we looked at our news media, we wondered, is seasons of sorrow just going to be met with seasons of sorrow? Will sorrow have the final word? Or is lasting joy possible? It's not just a question for our global society or even our nation or even our state. It's a question that persists in our own hearts. It's one that persisted in the heart of the psalmist. And yet we find in this song a confidence that looks forward in spite of everything that surrounds the people of God. Against all odds, the psalmist's audacious vision of the future is one of joy. But not just joy. It's one with songs of joy. Not just songs of joy. It's one with barrels full of joy. This audacious vision is a vision of the future that says joy is on the horizon, even though we don't know what is to come in the meantime. It's a vision that actually animated Archbishop Desmond Tutu in his fight against apartheid. In a 1992 interview with Christianity Today, he was asked this question: "Are you hopeful as you look ahead?" His response: "I'm always hopeful. A Christian is a prisoner of hope." What could have looked more hopeless than Good Friday? But then Easter. God says, from this moment on, no situation is untransfigurable. There is no situation from which God cannot extract good. Evil, death, oppression, injustice, these can never again have the last word, despite all appearances to the contrary. These again can never have the last word. Desmond Tutu echoes the psalmist and reminds us of the only assurance for this audacious vision of the restoration of joy, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The very life of Jesus Christ points to this restoration of joy. In Advent, we were reminded in Luke 1, when Mary visits Elizabeth, the baby in Elizabeth's womb leaps for joy in the presence of Jesus Christ. In Luke chapter 2, when the angels visit the shepherds to give the announcement of the arrival of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, they say, "We bring you good news of great joy." The life of Jesus Christ points to this restoration of joy. In John chapter 2, what was Jesus Christ's first miracle? His opening act was to turn water into wine to ensure that the joy did not stop. Almost to say, in the face of the question, will sorrow have the final word or is lasting joy possible? He says, here's some more wine. Continue to experience more joy. In the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we find a down payment for the resurrection of joy. In the darkness of Good Friday, in the absence of Holy Saturday, Jesus is raised from the dead, and in his dying, he destroys death. In his rising, he restores life. And in all things, the resurrection of Jesus Christ assures us of this: sorrow will not have the final word. Lasting joy indeed is possible. And dear friends, I have good news. Not only is lasting joy possible, but in Jesus Christ, lasting joy is now made eternal. In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen.